I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. Yes, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here on Black Liberation Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Very happy to be your host. Happy New Year. If you're in the mid-Atlantic to the East Coast of the United States, welcome to this. Might as well enjoy this snow while we get it, while it still occurs. Uh, so yeah, welcome everybody. Please do come on in, like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, blackliberationmedia.org for more. Uh, thank you. So I don't mind taking credit for the thumbnail, the inspiration for it, and the call to do it is squarely the credits, should all go to Dr. Erica Edwards, who we're going to talk a little bit about this morning, and the other side of terror, which, as I continue to read it, we'll discuss more, but it is already providing a lot uh, of. It's provocative. It's definitely provocative. So, and what she has to say about Kerry Washington is there's a lot there. So, but right on. Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Hope you're all doing at least relatively well. And again, while I know there's a lot of things, oh, by the way, the remix is starting up again this week. And though I'm going to continue my little break, the remixers, the rest of the crew will be holding it down. So please do come on back and get your remix fix back in effect. And to that point, I know, as they'll talk a lot about, I'm sure there's a lot going on in the world that deserves much more attention and focus. So I hope folks don't mind that I not unrelated, but differently focused on some issues for this morning. Uh, just a break, just a break. Gotta, you know, um, enjoy this break and theoretically get some work done. And I am teaching a class this winter session too, albeit asynchronously and online, which I don't like, but it does require some work and some time. And some of that we're going to be talking about today because in preparation for that class and trying to find new ways, just not only to learn, but find new ways to teach and keep myself uh, energized. There's some things that I want to talk a little bit about. Yeah, there's been a lot of violent news in the last 12 hours, and there's one angle that I'm interested in following up a little bit more, and I admit a little bit of a sensitivity to it. Although again, my sentence in the U.S. military was relatively short and relatively to many uneventful, but this connection between the U.S. military and these attacks is, I think, something that should get a good amount of attention, and obviously with an appropriate frame. Yeah, a lot going on. But where I thought I would start this morning, so please do go back if you haven't and watch the show we did Saturdays with Renee. And again, shout out to her, and she did a great job of after the show, uh, emceeing Andy Ellis's Green Party campaign for governor of Maryland, uh, uh, Renee hosted the launch of that campaign in Annapolis, Maryland, in spite of the freezing temperatures because it was outside. And so shout out to her and to them and a couple people there who are somewhat regular attendees here in the remixing community. Shout out to them as well. We saw Namdi Lumumba there, my buddy Hari Hig guy whose name I keep messing up, but I got to get together. Who works out here in a lot of Howard County, Maryland efforts was there, and he's a supporter of the platform as well. So salute to all of them. So yeah, it was a good time. But during the show Saturday, we revisited. Well, for me, it was like a somewhat of a triggered revisitation. Speaking of PTSD, uh, with um, my PTSD related to previous debates and engagements, and just having to sort of suffer the popular analysis of Michael Eric Dyson for so many years. And to see Dyson on Brianna Joy Gray's show the other day or a week or so ago, so I think we made good political use of it in the sense in that one of the points that Renee and I kept making was that if you pay attention to that debate, so much of what Dyson has to say is a regurgitation of stuff he's been saying for a long time, and that all defenders of lesser of evil voting have been saying for a long time. And then Renee and I sort of decided in the moment, given time and interest and whatever, and for me at least a little bit, just it's just like a ugh. I had put together, found a couple of segments where Glen Ford is either talking about Dyson or debating Dyson. And we decided Saturday, we don't need to go through all of that. But this morning, we are going to start there. I went back and watched again, and I was like, you know what? And then one of my homeboys was like, man, you should, the only criticism he had of our show Saturday was that we didn't play it. He was like, you got to let people see. You got to, people got to remember who Glen was. People got to remember what Dyson had been saying for a long time. So I did. So we will start today. We're going to play 1/3 of the 3 parts of Dyson's debate in 2016 with Michael Eric Dyson on Democracy Now. No, I think that was 2000 because it was before. Now I got the timing messed up. Maybe it was 2014. And then I'm going to play an interview that I did with Glen during when I used to host Glen for the Ford Report on the Real News Network. And we'll see how I react to it this live this morning, how petty I'm feeling and how much time we want to spend reminiscing about that time. But there's so many contradictions about that segment that have nothing to do with me and Glen. But they were but nonetheless. But I thought we should play them because really, more importantly, is that as I mentioned Saturday, when you see Dyson. Anyway, we're going to start there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about settler colonialism and internal colonialism, uh, because I've assigned some readings for my classes and wanted to talk a little bit about those readings here this morning. So that'll be sort of the second part. And then I do want to end the show talking about at least sort of an introduction to Dr. Erica Edwards, The Other Side of Terror, um, where the thumbnail for this show is derived. And so that's what so there's overlap and there is a through thread for today's show, but those are the 3 parts. Uh, Sort of a commemoration and remembrance of Glen Ford, the silliness of Dyson's prolonged arguments, settler colonialism, and then insurgent grammars, as Dr. Edwards calls them. talk a little bit about some insurgent and imperial grammars uh, to wrap up the show this morning. So as I said, when Saturday, when I was watching Dyson with Brianna, and I thought, as we said Saturday, please go watch the show because we really break down the content of that interview and Brianna's interviewing skills and Dyson's nonsense and all of that. So if you haven't watched it, please go check that show out from Saturday. But one of the points that I did make that had me sort of rethink this, and my homeboy had me also rethinking this, is that one part around the 43rd minute of the Brianna Joy Gray interview where Glen Ford's name comes up, but Dyson just sort of says, "My man Glen," quickly, and then keeps moving. If we were to give Dyson the benefit of the doubt, we could say he wanted to keep it moving because he knew he and Glen did not get along, did not like each other, and that Glen had m- maybe less respect for Dyson than I do. Like there was no love lost there. But that as a preacher and a good guy, Dyson wouldn't want to speak ill of the dead. So let me just. But for those of us not so inclined to give Dyson that much of the benefit of the doubt, we might read that as you don't want to really be remembered or reminded of not only Glenn and his brilliance, but you don't want to be reminded of the analysis of the actual left and black left that you've been fronting as a representative of and looking to avoid for decades. And one day I am going to go back and I'm going to revisit Dyson's, because I mentioned this Saturday, and revisit Dyson's testimony in front of Congress back in the early 90s in nominal defense of hip hop. And I think I'm gonna be able to show the through line there as well. That Dyson's lane has often been uh, a symbolic, capable. He's no dummy. Capable spokesperson of an actual left politics, an actual black left politics. And he's wanted to be seen as that for a long time, and this is why, as you'll hear in a moment, he had to at one point go at Cornell West, why he had to much of a lesser extent challenge me, to he had to challenge Glen Ford. He had to do all of that because to be seen as I've said Saturday, the one of one, the Highlander series survivor of black spokesperson and representation to a white liberal left. You got to do that. You got to distance yourself from the black radical tradition and any emissary of that tradition, particularly the more capable ones like Glen Ford. So I didn't like that he did that. And then maybe this is just me being an old man, but it did occur to me this might be one of those moments where Brianna, in her generational moment, and sort of relatively speaking, belatedly coming to a left politics, or a left, increasingly left politics post her Bernie Sanders experience, may or may not have been that familiar with Glen Ford, Black Agenda Report, or all of those histories. She just would have been too young chronologically, and then may just have never thought or taken the time or been encouraged to go back and review that history. So it was great that she pulled up the clip when he was on Bill Maher, that is Dyson on Bill Maher, making himself look foolish, and catching him in his false representation on her show. But this was a couple things that she did miss here. So, all right, so I'll start with, in chronological order. This is just part one, because the whole debate is like, I don't know, more than 30 some odd minutes, but just part one of maybe it was 2014. The actual date is not in the show description. No, from September 2012. from September of 2012 is at least when it was posted to YouTube. So we'll start there with this, and then we'll play. They're both roughly 8-minute clips, the two that I'm going to play. So, but I think
this is Democracy Now.
So this is, of course, Amy Goodman and Democracy Now. I'll put the links in the show description if they're not there already. And so you can see, more and follow up and watch the whole debate if you really want to reminisce. But yeah, okay, here we go.
DemocracyNow.org, Breaking with Convention, War, Peace, and the Presidency, as we turn to our two guests for a discussion and debate about President Obama's speech and record. We turn to Michael Eric Dyson, who's joining us here in Charlotte, North Carolina, professor of sociology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., author of many books, including Can You Hear Me Now?, The Inspiration, Wisdom, and Insight of Michael Eric Dyson, and Making Malcolm, The Myth and Meaning of Malcolm X. And in New York City, we're joined by Glen Ford, a veteran journalist, executive editor of BlackAgendaReport.com. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! You were inside last night in the Time Warner Cable Arena. It was supposed to be held at the Bank of America.
My bad. I got to do this. Dyson has all those books because this was something he made. This was part of his career trajectory. It's so like we might talk about how today a Gerald Horne is super prolific with his writing and has, again, as I often joke, has probably written another book in the time it's taken me to say just this sentence. But whatever people think of those books, Horne's books have a certain academic and political positioning and framing and substance to them that make that prolific production that much more impressive. Dyson wrote a lot of books in the 90s and early 2000s that were meant to be topical and to keep his name in the mix, so to speak. They're not deep. And I did give him credit for his criticism of Bill Cosby in that book, but even that book, they're not intellectual heavy lifting. They're not. One of his books that I was asked to review years ago for WPFW, shout out to 89.3 FM, Washington, D.C., Pacific Radio, But years ago, I was asked to review one of his books on hip hop, and it was a transcript of interviews he did with grad students. So that's the kind of so it doesn't mean that there's nothing you could glean from them, but they're just not the level of, they're not intellectual heavy lifting that they're just meant to keep him in the mix. So if you are particularly a reader maybe, but not a scholar, or you are, someone whose only interaction with academia or scholarship is from those you see interviewed maybe on a Democracy Now! Or worse on an MSNBC, and particularly Black scholarship, like if you don't engage Black scholarship, but you watch Democracy Now! And you're like, ooh, this guy named Michael Eric Dyson, he seems like he's, and he's written all these, I want to know about Tupac. I'll go read a book, or Tupac, as they would probably say it. I want to know about Tupac. I'll go and read a Dyson book. Oh, I want to learn about Malcolm X. Ooh, Dyson wrote a book. I'll go read that. So that's the way, that's the kind of authorship that we're talking about here. And I say that as somebody who is not a super prolific academic producing scholar. And I say that as somewhat highly critical and very well aware of my own, limitations with writing and productivity. But it's still fact. It's still just the truth of the matter here. But anyway, okay, here we go.
Stadium, but because of weather, that was canceled. Right. Talk about your response to his address last night.
Well, it was electrifying in the sense that Obama had before him the task of repudiating all of the myths and the lies and the deceptions and the deliberate distortions generated just a week earlier in the Republican convention, but also to rally the base, so to speak. And various aspects of that base had been either disaffected because they felt that they were marginal, or that his progressive agenda that he had initially articulated had not come to fruition. But many of them have been chastened by the intransigence of a Republican Congress that refused to acknowledge anything of worth that the man could put forth. So he's operating in a very difficult zone. So he's got to organize his resistance to the Republicans.
Do y'all remember how bad this was?
Base,
this is
give a
triggering
speech
for me too.
flowing enough in poetry, but rooted enough in public policy. Starting with Michelle Obama a couple nights before that, and then Bill Clinton himself in his vintage form. Obama, I think, took the baton and ran the last leg, and did so with aplomb, with verve, and with oratorical flourish.
Glen Ford, your assessment.
Well, it certainly isn't the sports-like assessment that I just heard from the good doctor. We at Black Agenda Report have for some time been saying that Obama is not the lesser of evils, but the more effective evil, and we base that on his record and also on his rhetoric at the convention. So we would prefer to talk about what history-making events have gone down under his presidency. He's first of all created a model for austerity, a veritable model with his Deficit Reduction Commission. And he's introduced preventive detention, a law for preventive detention. He's expanded the theaters of war and drone wars, and he's made an unremitting assault on international law. And I think that possibly the biggest impact his presidency, and I'm not talking about all this light and airy stuff from the convention, but actual deeds. I think probably what will go down as his biggest contribution to history is a kind of merging of the banks and the state, with $16 trillion being infused into these banks, into Wall Street under his watch, and the line between Wall Street and the federal government virtually disappearing.
You know, what's interesting is that, look, despite the poetry of my dear friend Glen Ford, the reality is that the American left will never be able to participate not simply in the pageantry of American politics and the light and airy stuff that conventions engage in, of course, the fluff and the desiderata may be absolutely true, as Mr. Ford has indicated, but the reality is that Obama is as progressive a figure who has the chance of being elected in America. Friedrich Engels is not going to be the Secretary of Labor, and Marx will not be the Secretary of Treasury. Bottom line. Now, having said that, all of the stuff that Glen Ford has talked about is absolutely right in an ideal world.
Message!
Erosion can be stemmed by progressive forces that have an upsurgence
this is the same thing he said during Brianna's
But if you ain't in the game, Miami Heat is playing it's talking about sports, is playing the Oklahoma Thunder. It's not, I'd prefer it be the Los Angeles Lakers. This is the game we're talking about. And if the American left can't be involved in the actual practice of government to offer the critical and salient insights that are available, take 2000 when siding with Nader, then Al Gore, who should have been president, who would have prevented some of the stuff that we see now happening, didn't occur. The left won't take responsibility for the fact that with the extraordinary intelligence of a Glen Ford and many other leftists notwithstanding, the reality is that he's the most progressive president, as Gary Dorian, an American leftist who teaches at Union Theological Seminary, argues, since FDR. Those are the stakes on the ground. We're talking about what he's done with earned income tax credit, when we talk about bailing out the American automobile industry, when we speak about the fact that Affordable Health Care Act is put forth, you talk about pre-existing conditions. When you speak about across the board what Obama has been able to do despite the intransigence of the Republican Party, then you talk about on-the-ground practices of actually achievable political goals. I think, Glenn, we have to take that into consideration.
Glen Ford.
Well, what Obama has done has actually moved the entire debate to the right. He claims that he's the one standing between the Republicans and Social Security and Medicare and the entitlements. But it was Obama 2 weeks before he even took the oath of office who said that entitlements would all be on the table. This was at a period in which the Republicans were in disarray, couldn't mount a challenge to anything. Obama followed through and created this model for austerity with his Deficit Reduction Commission, which came up with the figure of $4 trillion in cuts, which he now includes among his solemn promises to the American people. Those cuts would savage, in fact, Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. We say that he is the more effective evil because he is able, being a Democrat, to accomplish more of that right-wing agenda than the Republicans ever could. Remember, George Bush tried to privatize Social Security. He got his worst domestic defeat of his term in so doing. And the Republicans were reeling from that even in 2009. It took Barack Obama to introduce the model for austerity. And it is, it certainly is a twist on history. I think it's a lie to claim that he is the bulwark of defense. Now, we need to tell the truth. That is our first obligation, not just get in the game as the rules of the game have been laid down by either of those corporate political parties.
So again, that's just part one of three, but you see already that, I mean, it's just the same thing that the Dyson, the script is the same. Blame the third parties, say that the left is smart but is not in the game to win. And then you just continue on with a defense of the Democratic Party. All right, so one more here that I went and found because it's it they took down all my other stuff, but at least I think these segments with Glen are still up there, so at least they did that. But they left that there. But uh anyway, there's so much. Let me just play this. Let's just this would have been around 2015. Yeah, yeah.
Welcome, everyone, back to the Real News Network. I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore. Since joining the New Republic earlier this year, author and Georgetown University scholar Michael Eric Dyson has used his post there to attack Cornel West, defend Ta-Nehisi Coates, and most recently to explain how he thinks Hillary Clinton will offer more for Black America than did Barack Obama. In his latest piece titled "Yes, She Can: Why Hillary Clinton Will Do More for Black People Than Obama," Dyson writes, quote, "If we were betrayed by Bill Clinton and suffered dashed hopes under Obama, maybe, just maybe, we will get from Hillary Clinton what we most need and truly deserve: a set of political practices and policies that reinforce the truth that Black lives must and do finally matter." For a look at this seemingly odd claim is executive editor and founder of Black Agenda Report, Glen Ford, for this edition of the Ford Report. Glen, welcome back to the Real News.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity, as always.
So I'll start with that. I mean, how do you distill this argument or claim that that Dyson seems to be making here, or does in fact make, not seems to be making, that Hillary Clinton will do more for Black America than did Barack Obama?
Well, Jared, this is some vapid, empty stuff, and it makes no mention or explanation of what she might do. It's just some vague, she will do things. Michael Eric Dyson is famous for throwing up a wall of words, and when he does that, it's usually to signify his obedience to people in power. And so this piece is just more of the same. And this time, he's signaling his availability to serve Hillary Clinton, who he anticipates will come to power in the next election. That's what this exercise is all about. The problem here is that Dyson is a kind of ill-mannered, nasty type of courtier of power, in that he likes to take swipes at people who are on the way out, as Barack Obama is on the way out, even though he kissed their butts when they were in power. So he writes that Obama was a big disappointment to lots of Black people like himself who had looked forward to Obama giving leadership. And he says that Obama has been of little practical use to Black people during his time in the White House. But Michael Eric Dyson was a huge booster for Obama for most of Obama's presidency. And I know that because I had to debate him twice. And he was a booster just like the rest of the Black misleadership class. They are all, him and they, trying to reinvent their own personal and political histories. They're trying to position themselves as constructive critics of the Obama presidency rather than the bootlickers that they were until very recently. The truth of the matter is that Obama got away with doing nothing for Black people, and in fact, for doing very bad things, doing great harm to Black people through his austerity policies and his attacks on social programs. He got away with that because people like Michael Eric Dyson demanded nothing from Obama and, in fact, vigorously, loyally defended Barack Obama until recently.
But Glenn, could then this be seen as his attempt to offer up a demand? I mean, he says in the piece that he expects that Hillary Clinton will provide policy and an actual practical, tangible response to the conditions of Black people in this country, unlike Barack Obama, who could lean on his Blackness, and unlike her husband, Bill Clinton, who could lean on his charm. She, having none of that, as he says, might be left to actually do something, unlike the two men, most expected to have done something during their presidencies before her.
He is not only incapable of making any demands of power. In this long article, which is about Hillary Clinton, he does not even say anything of substance at all about her foreign policies or her domestic policies or what he thinks her foreign policy might be or what he thinks her domestic policy might be. In fact, all he comes up with, and I think this is really a strange quote, I'm going to read it to you in order to explain why he's supporting, clearly, Hillary Clinton, is this. Basically, he says that if Bill Clinton gave Black America bad policy and Barack Obama gave Black America no policy, then Hillary Clinton is left only with good policy. Now, Jared, what sense does that make at all? I can't even understand it. He says that she is sensitive, that she displays sophistication, all of these valueless words.
Well, she did meet with Black Lives Matter activists.
And that is how he proves that she is sensitive and sophisticated. And, really, this does not reflect very well on Black Lives Matter when Michael Eric Dyson says things like that. Hillary clearly has profited politically from her two meetings with the Black Lives Matter organizations, although I don't see how Black people as a whole have profited at all. She is getting credit for being racially engaged. And that's why Dyson is so impressed, because he wants people in power engaging him as a power broker in the next administration. And this article is just part of his audition. And unfortunately, I fear that this is also what some of the folks in the Black Lives Matter organization are also up to.
Well, Glenn Ford, thank you again for joining us again for this edition of the Ford Report here at the Real.
Yeah, man, rest in power, Glenn Ford, man. And yeah, Josh, there's some smirking because if you ever see, I mean, it's like a lot of people that you hear about. If you ever knew Glenn was fucking hilarious. And before the camera would roll, and this was at a time where Glen and I were, we weren't on the best of terms, but but I will say, and I do need to say this, Paul Jay in the Real News Network initially did not want Glen Ford appearing on that network. There were like arguments and disagreements, and once it became clear to Paul that not only was Glen brilliant, but Glen had the pulse of Black radical thought that few had or could convey, and that Paul needed more Black representation at the Real News. That's where the Ford report, and then when I got there, that's when the Ford report kicked off. Like because I was going to interview, even despite where we were personally, I was going to be interviewing Glen regardless, regularly, while I was there. So, and I was only there for about a year on a sabbatical, and that whole story is another discussion. Why that sabbatical, why I was there for the sabbatical, how that all happened is a whole other thing. But I do need to. I can't help. I gotta point that out. It's because it was irritating to me at the time, and it's irritating to me to see. Um, and Glen and I would talk about that then. Like, what's really going on around here. And Glen was very clear. Glen understood. But Glen's primary focus was always the work. So it really didn't. He really, other than some jokes, it didn't matter. But to him. But anyway, that's but even though we weren't on the best of terms, even then, before the cameras start rolling, we would be cracking up and making fun of. I mean, because Dyson was. I mean, and yeah, somebody asked. Yes, Dyson actually said that. This was so when you see him on with Brianna Joy Gray fronting like he was trying to make a tactical choice to keep the left relevant or whatever he was claiming. No. He was a full-fledged flag waving, card carrying, myth making, and said, yeah, Hillary's going to do more for Black people than Obama or anybody else. I mean, and yeah, to champion Obama, and like people, like, you got to remember from that time, if you or go back and look, Dyson, and this was something that I remember Glen and I used to make fun of. Dyson would complain even publicly through jokes that he never got the invitation from Obama to hang out at the White House, at least not initially, even though he had done so much to get him elected. Like, a lot of people were really like, Obama's going to have me hanging out, and we're going to be, I'm going to, get my White House time and all this other kind of stuff. Like, he really, and when it didn't go that way, he got pissed. And Dyson would publicly go through criticizing Obama for that. And yeah, so to try to rebrand himself today with Brianna as, while still making that same whack argument, you know. But as you see there, Glen, I mean, it just took a few minutes, 5, 6, 7 minutes in an interview, and it's and then as Glen also reminds, even in that short and even indirectly, Black Lives Matter was not the thing. And he saw as much as anyone how Black Lives Matter was not some heir to a revolutionary struggle, and was not some advance and not some benefit to Black people, but was uh, about a capitulation to the Democratic Party and liberal politics, and a false symbolic representation. Again, he was so clear on that and aggressive in his hostility towards Black Lives Matter that it got to the point, and I remember this vividly because I was still around at that point, that from the three sisters, the founders themselves, to all of the other acolytes, people were like, Glen is doing too much. Glen he's going too hard at those women. He's being too rough with them. And Glen used to say very clearly, privately and publicly, I don't care. I'm not here to make friends with these women. I'm not here to give some false support to sisters over. If you want to support sisters, support Asada, like real, or support real revolutionary Black women that are doing work. That's it. I thought they are trained Marxists. And that whole thing, that was so, again, and that interview only took place because had a few mutual friends with Patrice and them. And because after a long back and forth with Alicia Garza, or I should say, not long, the emails, a couple of the emails were long, not the length of time. Where the whole point was, Jared, your association with Glen, even though you're trying to do this with the Real News and you're not with Black Agenda anymore and this, that, and the third, your whole association with Glen puts you in a position where I don't really want to talk to you because he was so rough with us. And the whole point, anyway, whatever. So I just wanted to take a moment and revisit that this morning. And by the way, I went looking for my book. I couldn't find it, but the Houston Baker book, Betrayal or Betrayed, from, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, is a brilliant reminder of how bad Dyson, and he was critical of Cornel West in that book, and a lot of those, Adolph Reed's work on what does he say? What are the drums telling you, Booker? What is that essay about the Dyson and them, the Black pundits who want to? These are brilliant critiques from back then about what these Dyson types have always, the Henry Louis Gates, what they represent in these spaces. And I think those lessons should be revisited. They were definitely not ready for Glen. Definitely not ready for Glen. I don't know if he was rougher than Elder Rafiki. I'm not saying, I'm just saying, I'm saying, I'm just saying, in terms of having a routine, weekly, organized journalistic output that was sort of undeniable. They were not ready for Glen. No, so the debate between me and Dyson was never put up. So it wasn't that the Real News took it down, and I was even complicit at the time in, if not agreeing with it not being posted, I at least didn't fight for it to be posted. And it wasn't just me, and it was me and Glenn Ford against Dyson and Dr. James Peterson. Forgot the sister's name from the Real News who was moderating it, and I thought the moderation was poor. I thought Glenn being sick that day didn't help. My losing my temper didn't help. Dyson was on his A game in terms of the verbal whirlwind, or the wall of words, as Glenn put, and he had the crowd. He had elements of the crowd rocking with him. He did the whole, I'm a preacher, I'm in the streets, and I mean, he did the whole thing. And as I said Saturday, it just led to me at one point just telling them to shut up. And then I do remember, like, he was, after the debate, he was walking out, and he did that thing where he's walking out, and I said, why are you talking like that on your way out the door? Like, don't get all, don't get all loud with it as you're leaving. So he heard the challenge and came back over. And because I guess we had been seated most of the time, I don't know, but I was like, that was the first time I realized, like, he was, much shorter than me. And then I remember, and then, but he came over with that whole different energy. And Dyson, you remember this? And looked up at me and said, "Wow, come on, man. All right, man. Why don't you like me, man? Why you give me such a hard, he was like, why you hate me, man?" And I remember thinking, I was like, I don't hate you, dude. It's not personal. You keep making these whack ass arguments. I'm not ready to fight anyone. I just, and in fact, there was, I'm not ready to fight anyone. But that is something I don't like that people do, and I've been accused of that. I remember when we were in Cuba, this dude that I ended up, he was my roommate, but we ended up not. Oh man, it went real bad, and but we got into an argument, and we were at the pool in Cuba. And I remember I was walking away and I was like, man, bah, 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 bah. And he said that to me. And he said, oh, you gonna get loud as you walk away? And I was like, what? And I was like, I walked right on back over there. But so and because I recognize that. So when people do that to me, I don't like that. I don't like that. Don't get louder as you walk away. The difference was I kept my same energy when I went back over there. Dyson's energy did a 180, and he was like, and he did the whole, he did. He was like, why do you hate me so much, man? Why don't you like? And I was just like, oh, God, I don't like your arguments. But the debate it was so bad, and everybody, and I think I've shared this before, but everybody at the Real News, and I remember, like the next day, and even after the next day, I went to I used to go to the editorial board, the editorial meetings in the morning, and the vibe, you could see everybody was like, nobody wanted to make eye contact with me. Nobody wanted to really talk about it. Everybody felt like, Jared, you really did not do a good job. And I agreed. I didn't. And Paul certainly didn't think I did a good job. And I remember at one point, and it pissed me off in the middle of the debate, because he walked over and during a break, and he whispered, he said, come on, man, be funny, like when we were having that debate with the Jacobin crew. And I was like, and I remember thinking, I don't remember what I said, because it was a quick break in between the shots. But I was like, I'm not here to perform. And I might have even on purpose got worse. Like, I'm not performing for you. But anyway, there were a couple people. So Greg Carr was there. Davon and Lawrence Grand Prix from Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle were there. I think Adam Jackson was there. And so there were a couple people who were around who were there. But anyway, it was just bad. It was just bad. I know. It was acting a fool in Fidel's Paradise. I know, it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing. And that whole story is even worse. Dude turned out to be, but again, I was vindicated. I proved to be correct in that one. But yeah, you can't take me nowhere. You can't take me nowhere. Yeah, that's what it felt like. Dance, Jared, dance. And I was like, what? It was my version of when you watch the Petey Green movie and he gets on Johnny Carson, and then he realizes he's performing for white folks and he can't do it. That was like my version of that. I was like, I remember thinking, I was like, oh no, 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 no. But anyway, but Glenn Glenn through Democracy Now!, through those other segments with me and certainly his writing and other interviews and other things, Glenn definitely demonstrated the fallacy in Dyson's arguments, and were he still around today, this stuff with Brianna and all this other stuff with Dyson would not have been as easily possible. So I just wanted to throw that back in there real quick. All right. So let me move now to talk a little bit about settler colonialism. So I'm constantly trying to find ways to reorganize everything that I'm doing, but my class is included, and I'm teaching again my sociology of mass communication course this winter, and I wanted to try it a little bit differently. But one of the things that I really rely on in teaching is classroom discussion. So web-based asynchronous teaching for me is not the because I think a lot of what I ask students to do and to deal with needs some conversation, because a lot of it is maybe unorthodox. I know a lot of these ideas and readings are being newly introduced, and with a couple of these readings, admittedly, they're the Robert Hind one in particular, like they're probably more grad level, or than sort of, although this is a 300 level course, but anyway. So I like, and even as a student, I liked to be able to, I would have really struggled with this asynchronous stuff, because at least in terms of understanding and comprehension, I need conversation. So, but what I've tried to do this semester is, again, reorganize everything around, starting with, before we can, what is the political context? And it's also a good way of being able to work in some discussions of what's happening around the world, in the Sahel, obviously in Palestine. And then for me, importantly, and for the students I end up working with, to connect these things back to Black populations in this country and elsewhere, and just to so I assigned a couple of readings. A couple of them are either new to me, or the Robert Hind one is something I haven't is old, and is renewed to me. And so I just thought I would talk a little bit about that this morning, and I'll check back in the chat in a little bit and get some of your feedback. And I do often read the comments later. But part one of the course is subtitled, "Do You Know Where You Are? An Introduction to Context." And where we're talking about settler colonialism, imperialism, and I'm gonna relabel it, given these readings, and just to say settler colonialism, colonialism, internal colonialism, and imperialism, and the state, to try to, the intent here, of course, is to bring students, as much as they haven't already been in other classes, or in previous classes with me, out of that previous political state of nature, where there's any attachment to concepts of this country being about freedom, democracy, liberty, and being on some automatic, linear, progressive march towards the light. Because obviously, I think, because to understand media, communication, so-called entertainment, propaganda, psychological, you have to understand the context, or at least understand how I'm approaching it. And again, I always make it clear, students do not have to agree with me to get an A. And with these kinds of things, they're not being judged on how well do you understand these concepts and histories and theories, but more, how much are you willing to try to engage and struggle with them and find ways to interpret them. So one of the questions they're asked is after the readings is, can you find ways in which, how did I word it, internal colonialism plays out in your life, something like that, or in your media environment. Just how much are you grappling with it? That's how they're graded, more than do you understand, because in a lot of this, I'm not claiming to be an expert or to understand, and with some of this stuff I may not understand it. Oh, and by the way, some of this is connected to a video I posted on my channel the other day, reposted, about internal colonialism, and Dr. Keeanga Yamada Taylor's resistance of the idea. And I think, though I haven't found where she explains her resistance to the idea, I think I've found where she may be getting the resistance to the idea. So we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, so I'm not, students don't have to become experts for this class on it, but I want them to have some sort of understanding, and then to be introduced to terms that are going to come up, especially as I'm going to assign some interaction, probably through the video, with Dr. Erica Edwards' work, where she talks about counterinsurgency. So I want them to, we're going to read a little bit about counterinsurgency, settler colonialism, and then this idea of media as reconquest, as Fons Wolf talks about in Selling Free Enterprise, that the manufacturers, the white business community wanted after the Second World War to reconquer America with a pro-capitalist brand. So that's what we're doing in this. And I assigned 3 articles, and then the introduction to Orisami Burton's Tip of the Spear. So those are the 4 readings that we're doing for this section. And the first one is actually, I was going to read it. I thought I was going to end up reading this for a conversation with Nick Estes, and that may or may not ever happen. I don't know. Everybody gets sidetracked, but it was the New York Times after October 7th. The New York Times in January of last year of 2024 published this article by Jennifer Schuessler, "What is Settler Colonialism?" And it's a New York Times piece, so we already know it's going to be limited, but it and so it's a New York Times piece. So we just, it is that. It is that. And but it makes a couple of references, and it offers an overview, and because it's written at the level of a popular American newspaper, it's somewhat more accessible, and I thought a good place to start for at least some of my students. So the article talks about the well, they call it the Israel-Gaza war. So, I mean, so there's all this kind of political framing I would want to correct in a classroom discussion, and I'll try to work this in the Canvas discussion. And maybe if I clip this and ask them to watch some of this video, I'll just use this to make the point here that students, please be aware that this is a genocide and an occupation, not a war. But nonetheless, to the author's point, one of the results of the really the Al-Aqsa flood is a return to a discussion of what's going on over there, and a return to the discussion or discussions of settler colonialism. So she says here, the concept of settler colonialism originates in academia, where its use has surged over the past 2 decades. And I kind of noted, I don't know if I agree with that, that it originated in academia, but I've and then she says it was then taken up by an activist left, and I've always kind of thought it was the other way around, but but that's fine. In other words, that ideas of internal colonialism, certainly within Black liberation spaces, for me, it seems to have started outside of academic spaces, and was coming out of a variety of radical intellectual spaces, both white and Black. But okay. And then she says here that it has its critics. More broadly, critics say that the embrace of the term reflects a dangerously simplistic view of history and a kind of moral derangement, as Adam Kirsch, an editor of the Wall Street Journal, wrote recently, which justifies violence and rests the permanent division of the world into innocent people and guilty people. So, of course, again, Wall Street Journal, of course, is going to have this sort of distorted view, where it's going to argue that anyone, because John Henrik Clarke, I agree, from the perspective of Adam Kirsch, would seem like morally deranged, because I agree with Dr. Clarke when he said that anything you do to free yourself from enslavement and colonization is morally justified. and which would include armed struggle, justifying armed struggle. So, of course, from the perspective of a ruling elite, and we see this popping up again after the actions, the alleged actions of Luigi, the ruling elite want the monopoly of violence. They don't want any legit discussion of or suggestion that people they oppress and exploit should be able to. So of course they're going to find ways to be critical of a settler colonial approach, and then they're going to be critical of. I don't think settler colonial theorization requires a permanent division of a world of innocent and guilty people. It requires, if anything, a realization of the permanent division created between the colonizer and the colonized, and the set of relationships that are set in motion from that. And that, of course, that the colonizer wouldn't want focus on that either. Again, but I found this interesting because there was some of this is somewhat new to me in terms of how others or my political enemies might have been looking at some of this, and where they've evolved some of their hate for, uh, you know, re-theorizing uh, uh, any relationship to power, but certainly one that involves an internally colonized population. Uh, Carolyn Elkins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Harvard, who co-edited a 2005 collection, Settler Colonialism in the 20th Century, says that she believes that there's purchase in the term, but that we have to be cautious how we use it, out of fear that will be misunderstood. Historians have identified many forms of colonialism. Some involve trade or natural resource extraction managed from afar. Others involve systematic exploitation of a local labor force with the profits sent back to the imperial center. While uses differ, settler colonialism generally refers to a form of colonialism in which the existing inhabitants of a territory are displaced by settlers who claim land and establish a permanent society where their privileged status is enshrined. They do recognize that Fanon is a major contributor to this way of thinking, and they recognize correctly that he argued that colonized people were justified in using violence to throw off their oppressors. But Adam Schatz, author of The Rebels Clinic, a recent book about Fanon that I have not read, said that for Fanon, he said decolonization did not involve a simple act of violent cleansing, but a social transformation that would reorder the relations between colonizer and colonized. So I don't know. So it does not necessarily mean that the solution to a situation of colonial injustice is for the colonizers to simply pack up their bags and leave, he said. So I don't know what the full interview was like, and I don't know. Again, I have not read Schatz's book, but what I would want to point out, and certainly with my classes and here, is that as I've understood Fanon, no, he was not meaning that a simple act of violent cleansing was the all healing, act, but he did argue that it was a necessary step, and that his point was, so in other words, not to diminish armed struggle, but to say that was a necessary step in the reordering of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. So there's an attempt here to reframe it in this Times article to suggest it's a critique of, obviously, again, to critique the idea or to condemn even the idea of armed struggle through an attempt to look like to kind of rebrand Fanon here quickly, lightly. But again, as I understood it and understand it, Fanon is arguing that the relationship does need to change, and to reorder those relations, to create the broader social transformation, does require armed struggle. Patrick Wolf, a British-born Australian scholar and the author of the 1998 book Settler Colonialism and the Transformation of Anthropology, is someone who gets a lot of reference. But again, I have not read that either. But I have read and assigned, and we're going to look at it here in a minute, one of an articles from Lorenzo Veracini. In a tribute to Woolf after his death in 2016, the scholar Lorenzo Veracini wrote that Woolf said he had included the phrase in the title at the last minute at the urging of the publisher. It occurs infrequently in the book itself, that is settler colonialism. Like the British, who had supposedly set up an empire without really wanting to, Veracini wrote, the committed anti-imperialist scholar kick-started a scholarly field in a fit of absent-mindedness. So Veracini, whose article that I've assigned is about the field of settler colonial studies, it at least credits Woolf with kicking it off, even if the idea wasn't much used. Settler invasion, Woolf wrote, is a structure, not an event. That is, it's not a historical episode that ends, but a set of relationships embedded in the legal and political order. And it rests, he wrote, on the logic of elimination. So we're going to come back to that point in Veracini's article, which I think is very interesting, even if I don't think I agree with it. I loved reading it because he gets into a lot of the different approaches to how colonialism is defined and not or should not be defined, and settler, internal, and it's so we'll get to that in a minute. But that I thought was, but for me, where I focus at least is, and where I would want my students to focus on this idea is on this point about the set of relationships. That for me, the point of and the importance of understanding settler or internal or any form of colonization are those sets of relationships, so that you can't be confused into thinking that those relationships can change through something symbolic or politically liberal. So that is, yeah. But one of the criticisms, and I've heard this even in my own experience, that when this article talks about Ned Blackhawk's book, again, which I've not read, The Rediscovery of America, Native Peoples, and the Unmaking of U.S. History, Blackhawk argues that as an idea that emphasizes indigenous elimination as one of its central features, it often minimizes the agency, adaptation, and resurgence of Native American communities, Blackhawk said in an interview with Mother Jones last year. And that's often what I got pushback on in my own efforts to engage a version of this, that the permanence of the colonial relationship and its persistence, in my own argument, has been said to deny the agency of those who are colonized. And I'm not, and my whole point is, and that's why I've really come to even hate the word agency. Agency, and for a variety of reasons, pun intended on that. But agency is, I think, an overhyped, if anything, that for me is the overhyped academic phrase or term meant to provide false hope in the insufficient analyses that are preferred by those in power, so that we can be, that we will think, hey, wow, look, I've appeared in a commercial. Hey, look, somebody who looks like me is in a movie. Hey, somebody won an award who looks like me. You know, that as we're going to come back to in a minute here, that for me is a problem. And I don't want to I think the focus on agency, the encouraged focus on agency, is used against what should be our encouraged focus on the intent of these structures of power. Settler colonialism as an as it says here, seeing settler colonialism as inherently connected to whiteness, some scholars argue, is simplistic. And this is going to come up when I get to the Veracini thing, that article, that uh, because there has been so many forms of settler colonialist experience and dominance in other parts of the world, whether it's the Japanese and the Chinese. They talk here about farmers in West Papua, uh, versus other indigenous populations. Like they're saying you can't just make it white versus black. But again, my experience isn't that people who advocate for forms of colonial theorization are exclusively connecting this to whiteness. They are recognizing that in certainly the last 500 years, it has been European dominance, imperialism, and settler colonialism that has been the dominant feature that has shaped the globe and its relationships and its order, its geography, even. So so this isn't to deny the horrors of a Japanese invasion in the 1930s of northeastern China, but that is not the dominant feature of the globe. That invasion has not dominated globally in the way the European conquering of the globe over the last 500 years has captured hearts and minds, again, pun intended. So that's why. So I don't know that people are exclusively connecting it to whiteness. They are just appropriately connecting it to whiteness, particularly over the last, looking at the current world order. That's again, not to excuse the Japanese and their behavior in China, but that's not what has been governing or dominating the globe. And talking about Rashid Khalidi, who I've read a little bit of, and we talked about some on Saturdays with Renee, said that in an interview that the concept was present, that his settler colonial concept was present in Palestinian writing of the 1920s and 30s, even if non-Arabic speaking scholars were not reading it. He said it also reflected the self-conception of early Zionists who primarily came from Eastern Europe. This was a movement that saw itself as operating as a colonial project under the sponsorship of the British, who controlled Palestine from 1918 to 1948. Khalidi said they made no bones about it until World War II. They called themselves settlers. They described their process as colonization. And as we've talked about here before, Theodore Herzl explicitly connected the Zionist project to European imperialism and colonization of the globe. And as we're going to talk a little bit about in the Veracini article, the point being, or one of the points being, that you have a group of Europeans moving from one place to the next and looking to not only replace the existing population, but to ultimately exterminate them. And as we see playing out right now, and as we've even covered, especially on the Saturday's show, as far as my involvement, is these explicit statements from the Israeli military and political leadership over the last year or so, saying, "Let's finish the job. Let's get rid of all of these. We're not going to stop until we get rid of all of the Palestinians." And then there's some discussion, as the author cites here, because of course, especially in the New York Times, they're going to find someone, Tom Segev here, who says that colonialism is irrelevant to the Zionist project, and that just, again, as Khalidi has already, that just belies what the Zionists have said themselves. So we understand that, especially right now, defenders of Israel would want to separate Zionism from colonization, uh, from discussions of settler colonialism in South Africa and whatnot. But I think at least some of us know better and do not agree. So, but again, that's, at least I wanted to. So for my class, say, look, settler colonialism is an important issue. It's been discussed in a variety of ways from a variety of perspectives for a long time. And it's essentially about a group of people leaving their home, going to where someone else lives, displacing them, and per one definition, eliminate the population. All right. Okay. All right. So let me. And obviously, in terms of my class, we'll here too, Avi, we'll continue the conversation there's, none of this is this video and this discussion this morning isn't going to satisfy. Now, which article was it that referenced the Robert Hind article? I'll just keep going in this order here. So then I also assigned this article, introducing settler colonial studies, from the aforementioned Lorenzo Veracini, published in 2011. And which I've found very helpful, even if I don't fully agree, I think, with some of the points being made here. But in terms of giving an overview of how various populations view these things, and again, this is where I think, so if you go, and I'll put it in the show description, if you go and if you want and you review a year or so ago, Adam Burgos, philosophy professor, I believe, published an article in which he talked about internal colonialism. And at one point of the article, and I can't remember if it was about this or to what extent this was a feature, and I can't remember, but part of the article was a discussion of how Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has said that she does not agree with the internal colonialism theory applying to Black America. And he goes through some of her work. I go through some of that work. I go through some of the back and forth with it, an AAIHS discussion of it, and another author. And the long story short is that Taylor doesn't really say much as to why she doesn't, or I haven't found where she says much as to why. Burgos didn't find much as to her explanation as to why she doesn't think the theory applies. I speculated at one point maybe she thought, like McCall Cabral did, that because, and it's kind of like Charles Penderhughes thinks, that you need to adjust and say, it's not a proper comparison because Black people are not comprised in one contiguous national space in the United States and are spread out throughout the country, that you have to, as Penderhughes says, call it internal colonies. Cabral said Black people are just not internally colonized in that way. So, maybe that's where I was speculating. But this article offers up some other ideas as to why she or anyone else might not agree that internal colonialism should be applied to Black America. Again, I don't agree with that, but at least there's some interesting arguments here as to why folks might feel that way. So, and I wanted students to be introduced to just a little bit of some of the debate and argument and how long this is being discussed and why, and just a little bit of the complexity. And again, just to stir up for my students in particular, some of the complications with just this preferred narrative that, Black people were dragged here, enslaved, freed them, Lincoln freed us, we did some marching, and now basically Obama got elected and now we're all equal. It's like, all right. So as he says right out the gate, colonialism is primarily defined by exogenous domination. So I think that's an important point. And even as I try to make that about Black people in the United States, I'm arguing that there are Black communities, that Black people are collectively treated in much along the lines of a colonized population, and that the domination of those communities is coming from outside those communities, from the white settler colonial state. And I'll link to where I can to where folks can get these articles. I do not want to run afoul of the JSTOR state mafia, and I, rest in power to Aaron Schwartz. I don't want that smoke. But because I'm not going to do any of these articles justice in discussing them this morning, relatively briefly, but and I do think this one I thought was fascinating, as is the Robert Hind one that I'm going to get to in a second. So anyway, but even the notion of internal colonialism is underpinned by a necessarily hierarchical distinction between different locales within a single polity. So that's one way that internal colonization is defined. that you have a country, and then within that country, you have another group that are held in distinction, that are held, that are forced to live separately, even within that country. So, like as we would argue, or has been argued, Black people, wherever Black communities, wherever Black people end up living, white people leave, forming forcibly that community become all Black, and then the relationship of a colony adheres. It takes over. Now, but then they get into this, the article gets into this distinction. Colonialism is not settler colonialism. Colonizers and settler colonizers want essentially different things. In any given colonial setting, there are different groups of colonizers demanding different things of the colonized. And this is where I can't remember if it was me or if it was Burgos, maybe in his article that we were talking about, where there was this question: is this where because one of the quotes from Taylor that explains why she doesn't agree with it had something to do with the relationship of Black, the dependence on wealth creation and profit from Black people was not the same as would be the case in a traditionally settler colonial or internal colonial society. That the economy doesn't, which would be an interesting argument for me to make with my buying power argument, because part of my buying power argument is that the power that is often associated by people who misunderstand the phrase is that Black people have this authority over their own and the national economy, were they to take advantage of it. And the critique that Taylor and others may have of applying an internal colonial or even settler colonial theory to Black people here in the United States is that Black people don't produce enough wealth for the society, that this country doesn't depend, that in traditional colonial situations, the colonizing community or country is dependent economically in terms of natural resource and productivity on that colonized community. Whereas here, Black people aren't needed for that. And in that way, I think there is some accuracy in the sense that the buying power concept is further exploded by recognizing how little importance Black people have in terms of producing wealth for this society. But my point is that my understanding and appreciation of internal colonialism and the colonial analogy is that colonization is more than just a material relationship. It's also an immaterial relationship that involves culture and worldview and self-concept. And we used to learn in just basic African history courses that one of the reasons why Portugal fought so long and hard for its colonial properties was not just an economic one, but it was one that they, for their self-concept and their ability to stand tall with their fellow Europeans, they needed to be able to demonstrate that they too had a lot of property. So, you know, yeah. So I don't know if that's maybe where she's coming from, that is Taylor or anyone else, as to why. So because of these distinct stances that create different conditions, um, on the one hand, the colonial encounter is mirrored by what I have theorized as a settler colonial non-encounter, a circumstance fundamentally shaped by recurring need to disavow the presence of indigenous others. On the other hand, in the case of the colonial systems, a determination to exploit sustains a drive to sustain a permanent subordination of the colonized. So this is where Veracini draws this distinction. In a settler colonial setting, the goal is to exterminate the indigenous population and replace them fully and permanently. In an actual colonial situation, the goal is not to exterminate them, but to permanently hold them in an exploitative relationship, which on the one hand is an important distinction, but I think on the other, could be said, I think could be said to be a distinction, maybe an unnecessary distinction to make, especially in this day and age, where despite current events in Gaza, the the goal of Israel cannot explicitly be, maybe even surreptitiously, as they said in the previous paragraph, to be extermination of Palestinians fully. It's clear Israel doesn't need Palestine or Palestinians economically, especially with all the support they get from the United States. But I don't know that I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on that. And maybe that's a more important distinction to make. Um, but uh, uh, but anyways, that's why I thought it was fascinating. That's my whole point. And for my classes, this is why I'm saying you're not being judged any more than I'm being judged on how well I agree or understand, how much I agree with or understand these arguments. But just that we look at complicating more than it is often done the relationship of any society that people have in any society, but certainly that Black people have to this one. So then if in this way, the internal colonialism thesis applied to Black people would apply more to a settler colonial thesis that has been said to be what this country, the United States, is. Because even though the United States is a product of a European group coming over here, for the most part, genocidally removing the indigenous population and creating a new country, the goal was primarily to erase the indigenous population, making it a settler colony. But then, in terms of the relationship it holds to Black people, it becomes more of an internal colonial relationship because there is no actual goal to eliminate an existing population that was already here per se, but one that, as I've argued, is meant to hold Black people in a permanent colonial status and relationship where there is an extractive material benefit, but also an immaterial benefit that goes to the colonizer for a variety. For one, you can have benefited from the extracted labor initially in building the country through enslavement, and and you can benefit materially from underpaying Black labor even post enslavement and so on. But per this definition of this argument, you could argue today that there is not the same need materially to have Black people produce for this country its wealth, but there is an immaterial need for it. And this is where we're going to get to Erica Edwards' part, to produce a symbolic. Maybe it's a shift. Maybe a better way of putting it for Black people is it's been a shift from a settler colonial relationship to an internal colonial relationship. Whereas Fanon would say, as I often quote, the goal is not to destroy the culture of the colonized, but to ossify it, to freeze it in a colonized form in a way that testifies against the very population that produces it, so that Black people are not meant to be exterminated per se, but held in a colonized state where we can produce culture, art, symbolic representation for empire, proof of the ability for American democracy to satisfy even the needs of the formerly enslaved and savage, and ultimately as a reminder of the brilliance and civilizational capacity of whiteness. No. Anyway, it's fun to. Patrick Wolf's name comes up again, and this whole thing about and I do like the line. I don't know the full context of it, or if I fully agree with how he or others are using it, but that this idea that settler invasion is a structure, not an event. But the permanence is not present under settler colonialism, which, on the contrary, is characterized by a persistent drive to ultimately supersede the conditions of its operation. because the settler is meant to, right, ultimately supersede the conditions of its operation. The persistent drive is to move beyond, to exterminate the indigenous and evolve something new. By the end of the trajectory, they claim to be no longer settler colonial. They are putatively settled and post-colonial, except the unsettling anxieties remain, and references to a post-colonial condition appear hollow as soon as indigenous disadvantage is taken into account. So yeah, the successful settler colonies tame a variety of wildernessness, end up establishing independent nations, effectively repress, co-opt, and extinguish indigenous alterities, and productively manage ethnic diversity. By the end of this trajectory, they claim to be no longer settler colonial, to be post-colonial. But that only works if you don't consider the continuing suffering of indigenous people. So in this country, they would say, look, we it may have started rough, but hey, it's all good now. In other words, whereas colonialism reinforces the distinction between colony and metropole, settler colonialism erases it. Because, and again, I agree I like all of this. It makes sense that if you really want to get to it, because again, the settler comes over here, and the white folks who started the United States didn't want people here referring back to in England. That was the whole point. That's why they had a revolution. So they got rid of the metropole colonial relationship and said, you're not being ruled from afar like we used to be. And that's why in that brilliant book by Patricia Bradley about the propaganda of slavery, she points out that the term slavery was used by white settlers in this country not to refer to what they were doing to Africans, but to refer to what the British were doing to them. And they rebranded slavery to mean this is what the Brits are doing to us. And they wanted to erase that. So they got rid of the relationship to the metropole. And whereas, traditional colonialism is saying, no, you're over there, we're over here, and you stay over there and produce for us. And that is how I see still the relationship Black America has. Yes, there's Black politics and there's integration in terms of symbolism and seating on buses and restaurants. But I think the 50th anniversary report that Diedrich Muhammad and others did about Columbia, Maryland, where I live, is perfect in summarizing this point that that I'm trying to make here. That while there's been an increase in Black people, an increase in at least the amount of Black people in Columbia, Maryland, the amount of interaction between Black and white has not increased. And I think that that's a perfect metaphor for what's happening in this country more broadly. Yes, there's more symbolic overlap and interaction. There's more symbolic integration. There's Black people everywhere. But the actual relationship between the communities has not changed. The actual interaction, the actual integration of communities socially, politically, financially has not occurred. So that distance still remains. So as it relates to Black people in the United States, I would say that the traditional colonial analogy still works, perhaps not the settler colonial one based on this argument here. But if we're talking about indigenous, maybe the United States is just a special brand of settler internal colonialism and genocide. And, it's just a special brand of it. And it's able to be it's beautifully multifaceted. It can, on the one hand, settler colonial, the indigenous people, internally colonized Africans, and capitalistically exploit white folks. It's congratulations, America. Anyway, colonialism and settler colonialism are not merely different, they are in some ways antithetical formations. Again, this is not to say that these antithetical formations do not intertwine in practice. They remain compatible, and the settler they remain compatible, and the settler colonial polities routinely operate colonially and settler colonially at once. So, Veracini is acknowledging that this is a possibility. So that's why it's interesting, this point here, that decolonization is not settler decolonization, and it raises some very interesting questions and points here. As Patrick Wolf has concluded, settler colonialism has remained impervious to regime change. The very language of settler colonialism does not allow an adequate approach to post-settler passage. Settler, for a start, underscores permanence, and settler as a term is premised on a fundamental contradiction, pitting the uncommitted colonist who will return home or the greedy absent speculator and his agents against the bona fide, actual, genuine settler who will stay. Or bona fide, actual. So, if you want independence from a settler colonial state, you have to, in other words, and this is where even my attempt to conceive of Black people as an internal colony. Well, then what does that mean? To decolonize would mean making white people go back to Europe. But if this is a settler colonial project, they're not going anywhere. So then decolonization means the destruction of the country, an erasure of the country in its entirety. Independence ostensibly proclaims that the polity is no longer exogenously ruled. Emancipation ostensibly proclaims that the person is no longer exogenously owned or otherwise impaired. So that means to end colonialism would mean you are no longer ruled from anyone outside the community. But under settler colonial conditions, the independent polity is the settler polity. And sanctioning the equal rights of indigenous peoples has historically been used as a powerful weapon in the denial of indigenous entitlement and in the enactment of various forms of coercive assimilation. This decolonization actually enhances the subjection of indigenous peoples under settler colonialism. Moreover, there is further structural reason why the two should be different, that is, settler colonialism and colonialism. While colonialism envisages a newer ending relationship where while colonialism envisages a never-ending relationship where the colonizer is forever subjecting the colonized, anti-colonialism necessarily endeavors to produce a fundamental discontinuity. Decolonization in theory ruptures the colonial cycle. In theory, in practice, structural inequalities remain, and neo-colonial arrangements reintroduce a fundamental continuity whereby the colonized still labors for the colonizer even after the colonial relationship has been formally discontinued. On the contrary, logically, whereas settler colonialism is designed to produce a fundamental discontinuity as its logic of elimination runs its course until it actually extinguishes the settler colonial relation, the struggle against settler colonialism must aim to keep the settler indigenous relationship ongoing. A similar point is made by Benedict Kingsbury in his analysis of indigenous claims of self-determination. Indigenous peoples routinely demand enduring relations, not their end. In other words, if colonialism ends with the colonizer's departure, that is, as mentioned, not a merely formal departure that announces a neo-colonial system of exploitation, settler colonialism ends with an indigenous ultimate permanence. There must be distinct ways out of structurally dissimilar situations. Now, what I think I'm reading here, this is what I was struggling, would want to struggle with in some discussion with my classes and even us. If, as I understand what's being said here, is that if you get rid of settler colonialism, you've eliminated yourself as an indigenous or a separately colonized entity. because the end of settler colonialism is an end of, and what he was saying earlier, the logic of settler colonialism is an elimination of the indigenous population. So when indigenous people or when Black people here would fight for some right of inclusion in the current state formation, they are advocating for an ongoing subjugation. They're arguing for an ongoing settler colonial relationship where the settler stays and is still distinct from the indigenous with the intent of eliminating that indigenous population. In thinking about decolonization and the decolonization of settler colonial forms as distinct propositions, I suggest we distinguish between reverse and reciprocal circumstances. In the one case, we would hypothetically have the colonized talking back to the colonizer and saying, "No, you work for me." In the other one, we would have the settler colonized telling the settler, "No, you go away." That this type of reciprocity ultimately maintains the original drive of both the colonial and settler colonial situations should be emphasized. On the one hand, the prospect remains, as in the previous dispensation, for a relationship that is still premised on domination. On the other, the drive remains as before for extinguishing of the relationships. Again, I may not have it right, but as I'm interpreting this, that's what's being said here. When we fight for integration, and this is where I'll start to make a transition here, because this is if we fight for a continuously, hence the Vernon philosophy, see ourselves as participating in this, then we're advocating not for an end of the colonial relationship, but for our participation and benefiting from it, or even a reversal of the roles, saying that now you work for me, when the goal should be that none of this operates this way, and that the settler colonial relationship ends, the internal or colonized relationship ends, but that would require a new world. All right. Not that I have a necessary an actual time constraint, but this is taking a little bit longer than I thought. So let me, but I do want to pull up this Hind article too that I also assigned, the internal colonial concept. So obviously there's a number of things happening. There's a settler colonialism, there's colonialism, and there's internal colonialism. Settler colonialism is being argued to be one group goes to another place and looks to eliminate the existing population. Colonialism traditionally is one group stays where they are, but rules another group from afar, and becomes the metropole or the home country, the mother country, so to speak. And again, as I conceive it, white America comprises the motherland or the metropole, and Black America, however it shows up dispersed throughout the country, is paying homage, obeisance, fealty, literal material resource to that mother country. The internal colonial concept, for me, argues that is the internalizing of that colonial idea. So that's why I'm saying that I do compare Black America to white America in the way I do find parallel between that relationship and the relationship of a traditional colonial, maybe not settler colonial, but colonial experience. That is one group living distinctly from another and dominating them from afar. Long story short, and I even wrote a summarizing note here because I figured that by the time I got here, it'd be going long. But the long story short here with this Hind article is that first of all, I thought it was fascinating. I loved. I feel like I read it a long time. I know the name, but maybe whatever. But the review or the return was great. Okay, so oh wow, I skipped my notes here. So the New York Times article I started with, Schuessler wants to politely and liberally dismiss the shortcomings of internal colonialism theory. That's what I think was the goal of the initial, and to make the point that that Israel's not really, Zionism is not colonialism, and settler colonialism as an idea should be, if not fully dismissed, it should not be applied to the United States or to Israel, or it should be it's a little more complicated than that. Veracini wants more nuanced study of these various colonialisms, hence settler colonialism studies. Hind, I've said here, may be providing the distinctions and forms of colonialism that perhaps Kiyanga Yamada Taylor was coming from, that may be informing her criticisms. And that I might be overdoing it here, or it might just be that this article is over my head, but I think the article ignores the political purposes behind the use of internal colonialism theory in Black liberation struggles. So when it offers, I think, an interesting criticism of internal colonialism, or it introduces readers to the idea, some of the history, and some of what the criticisms are, it doesn't really show those criticisms to be valuable or correct, and it doesn't, for me, show why it would be wrong for, or why the internal colonialism theory, as it's been applied to Black liberation, has been insufficient. And then the article doesn't really say what would be the preferred theorization then. So if not internal colonialism, what's better? Are you arguing then that this general approach to pluralism is better, whatever, that America's a democracy is better? All right. But the use of internal colonial theories to examine racial developments within the United States of America has become almost fashionable by the late 1960s. A decade later, a study of political economy of Wales described the internal colonial approach, which it criticized as a new variant of a time-worn model. So what this article is doing, published in 1984, it covers a lot of different approaches to the concept. It's not just talking about my variant, or how Black America has applied the variant, a variant of the theory. But as Ferdinand Broad said, no theory, no history. So any general history always requires an overall model, good or bad, against which it can be interpreted. I think I generally agree with that. Diverse forms. So there is, as it says here, the Trotskyite form of internal colonialism, saying that Stalin's forced collectivization was thus Trotskyism applied within a framework of internal colonialism. As was said here, Lenin depicts the migration of small industrialists and handcraftsmen from the central, long-settled, and economically advantaged regions of Tsarist Russia to the steppes as manifestation of the colonization of outer regions. So, like, for my classes, what I would want for my students to get from this is an introduction to this way of thinking, an introduction to some of the broader world histories that are referenced here, and then the way that Black people here in the United States have, as I've always appreciated the theoretical approach, returned themselves to the world stage of history, as Dr. Clark might have said at one point, by saying, not the same, it has distinct features, we have distinct issues and histories to deal with, but we are a group of humans too. And when the world is in consideration of uprise and reorganization and rebellion, we're in the mix too. As Hind talks about here, again, people have conceived the colonial relationship as occurring between the bourgeois north of Italy and the southern Italy and islands surrounding Italy reduced to colonies, the South African issue of Africans colonized within Southern Africa. I noted here I would like to read this article at some point, Stalinism, a Study of Internal Colonialism. There's Stalinism in this thesis, internal colonialism, is the use of state power by one section of society to impose unfavorable rates of exchange upon another. In the 1930s, the internal colonial image was used to characterize relations between the northern and southern parts of the United States. More recently, however, the imagery has become identified with inquiries into the experience of specific racial or ethnic minorities. I remember reading years ago Baran and Sweezy's book. What was the name of their book? But they wrote collectively wrote a book, White Communists, and they said that the American Civil War was a, 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 a colonial conquest, the northern industrial colonial metropole conquering its colonies, and the neo-colonial elites that had the plantocracy that had arisen there. Um, Eldridge Cleaver considered themselves elsewhere in the United States. Individuals such as Eldridge Cleaver considered themselves as stolen people held in a colonial status on a stolen land. While administration of the ghettos by outsiders is also depicted as an essential feature of conventional colonialism, other aspects of the experience of Black people are seen to differ from the classic colonial model. Within the country, they constitute a minority. They are less autonomous. They are more dispersed, and the group culture and social structure of the colonized is less developed. So maybe this is in part where Taylor finds, or others find, their some distinction again with the talking about, and again, Charles Penderhughes said the same thing in our discussion about it. Again, Black people are more dispersed, less autonomous, and simply constitute a minority, and therefore should be seen as, he would say, internal colonies. Maybe others would say that this is why they shouldn't be seen as internally colonized at all. My point has always been these are differences with little distinction. And more importantly is the relationship that Black people have, which is, again, wherever you find Black people in this society, their relationship to society is meant to be one of exploitation, extraction, symbolic abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thesis that relations between white and Black people in America are essentially those of colonizer and colonized contends that all of the former acquire or believe that they acquire some privileges and advantages from the relationship. However, it does not claim that the relationship developed by methods that were identical to those of conventional colonialism. For instance, the lengthy period during which the slave trade and slavery existed and the allegedly deliberate mixture of slaves from different tribes and regions to facilitate white control constituted a cultural attack upon Black languages, customs, and traditions of Black people in America of a severity not experienced by indigenous people in African colonies. Unlike their counterparts in colonial Africa, the American Black community has no indigenous institutions, with the possible exceptions of its religious organizations, and no general autonomous economy. Because that community is engulfed by the wider structure of society, by its occupations, its educational system, and so on, there exists amongst American Black people a movement for integration as well as one for autonomy. And I did note, I put the MOBP, that there is no autonomous economy, that there is no general autonomous economy. That's the whole point. So purveyors of the myth of buying power would argue, Black purveyors of the myth would argue that Black people need to act as if there is an autonomous Black economy that Black money can be recirculated in and used to evolve, but there is no such autonomous economy. I agree with that point. But again, while I don't think it is mutually exclusive, and I think, again, for my students and my classes, I would want to make the point that, again, this is not to say that every Black person is in the United States has the exact colonial experience of everybody on the African continent. It wouldn't even be to say that every continental African is colonized in the exact same form or fashion. It is to say that the ultimate goal is a colonial relationship where groups of people are held either in literal geographic distinction or certainly in social distinction. And I still do agree that Black people are held at minimum in social distinction, even when physically they are allowed to exist next to their white folks, to their particular prescribed white colonial rulers. But because But one of the differences may also be that, yeah, and this goes back to that other point about settler colonialism being distinct from colonialism. That if Black people are at least in some to some degree attempting to integrate, as well as separately work for sovereignty and autonomy, that ultimate, I guess that is ultimately for what Veracini would say is are movements designed to preserve one form of colonialism or another, either settler or traditional. But I don't, yeah, baby, I don't know. I don't know. But anyway, I just think it's interesting to consider. So if because there's an attempt, there are both attempts to integrate and have been attempts for nationalist autonomy, that one is a defense of or in yeah, is advocating one form of persistent form of colonialism over another. The autonomous one would be you have to make sure that neo-colonial bond is erased, as Veracini was pointing out. Otherwise, movements for national sovereignty just become colonial, as opposed to settler colonial or internally colonial. And again, this is similar to what is being said here by Hind, that when independence was gained, the legal equality proclaimed, the Indians were already placed in a position inferior to that of the rest of the population. That indigenous populations, in this case in the Central America, um, and this is why in this part I think it's interesting to introduce to students, just to say, look, you're not going to be tested on how well you understand or know this, but just to be introduced to the fact that these other parts of the world exist, that other parts of the world are having these kinds of conversations. And for me, importantly, that Black people have been part of these conversations and are part of these conversations of coloniality, in whatever form. But that without anyway, but the point being here that again, as I understood it, similar to the Veracini article, that Hind is saying that indigenous populations, even when there's an attempt to get independence, it's an argument for the permanent subjection as settler colonial, as defined as the settler colonial indigenous. When indigenous people say we want our autonomy and to be recognized as individual nations, but within this already existing settler colonial relationship, we're just advocating for the permanence of that settler colonial relationship, not an end to it. That's deep. I loved reading this article, and all of them actually, or reread, and prepare, in part because this level of confusion that I feel in this moment and that I want my students to feel is something that I encourage. I think it's good to have your concepts challenged and to have to think about things differently or renewed or for the first time. Just quickly here, Israel is mentioned, obviously. A study in internal colonialism has maintained that the social condition of Israeli Arabs is analogous to that of Amerindians and to that of Black people in South Africa. A lot of people have made that argument. And then I would just say it's just there are some questions raised about that here. I don't know that we need to, what I would have just wanted to do in the spring when my classes meet more regularly, I would want to have more discussions with them, and maybe I'll try to do this via Canvas for the winter session, but to get people to revisit what's going on in Palestine within this kind of context, within the context of considering colonization and how those patterns of colonization or forms are parallel or the same or slightly different. Again, I don't think the distinctions between South Africa and Israel are important at the level of, are only important at the level of really digging into the history and the specificity. I think the focus on the commonality is more important. And certainly for evolving a global, a sort of an internationalist frame, it's very important. All right, theories of internal colonialism derive from analogies, and these theses based upon them, the colonizing and colonized sections of society live in the same country. They could also embrace some colonialisms or other. They could also embrace some of colonialism's other characteristics, such as humanitarianism, So this is where I was like, what is Hind really saying here? That's what I meant. That's why I have the multiple colors here. So, right, theories of internal colonialism derive from analogies. So people are constantly making comparisons from what's happening here to what's happening there. The theories normally include such characteristics of conventional colonialism as political subjection, economic exploitation, cultural domination, and racial conflict. They could also embrace some of colonialism's other characteristics, such as its humanitarianism and the beneficial effects of its desire to civilize and Christianize. These aspects of the phenomenon are usually ignored by protagonists of internal colonial theories. Yeah, because protagonists such as myself of these theories are not thinking of the humanitarianism of colonization and the desire to civilize or Christianize. I don't see those as good things. By the way, I should remind again, this Robert Hind article was referenced in one of the other ones that I read this morning. Was it the New York Times one? I can't remember which one, but that's why I went and found the article again. I remembered the name. I recognized the name. I feel like when I was writing, I mixed what I like. I reviewed one of these, some of his work, maybe this very article, but yes, I would want to reject. So what Hind is doing here is not overtly offering what he thinks of the theory or what should be used. He's offering, I think, a pretty useful overview of how internal colonialism has been conceived by a variety of different groups of people historically, and where some of the criticism comes in. I haven't. But to include this section here is wild. That anybody should consider the humanitarian or beneficial aspects of its desire to civilize. I don't ever think of colonialism or imperialism as legitimately being a desire to civilize and to Christianize. Those are euphemisms for take advantage of and exploit. Yes, there may be people involved individually who believe that that's what they're doing, but that's not, and I don't think any of that is good. I don't think Christianizing is good, and I don't think it's civilization as it's been imposed through imperialism is that, and or was necessary to evolve what we would want as a civilized humanity. But so, the adaptability of the internal colonial concept, which has been related to states that once had empires and to those that were once colonies, to capitalist and to communist states, to entire political entities, as well as to some of their constituent parts, as in the case of Alaska and Quebec, is incontrovertible. So this is where now, so again, he had that little, this little bad part here. This is a mess. But what I do like is this part, this point being made here. There's a variety of ways. There's an adaptability to the concept. So he acknowledges that there's some value to the approach, even as he ultimately seems to not agree with it. That he says, it gains in flexibility and adaptability its theoretical application does lose its, he says, its rigor, but and that's also been part of where I've of some of the criticism I've gotten around, and I remember there was one experience that I had where an article I was trying to yes. So it's interesting. So Saturday, I did a Saturday Night Live, and somebody asked me if I'm going to publish with Dr. Burroughs. And I had said that my memory that night was that we had only actually co-authored one article, which was the very first thing I think I ever published back in the day, in an article in favor of the concept of B-span or a black C-span. And we co-edited the Malcolm X book, but the only other thing that I didn't remember Saturday that we actually tried to co-author involved a section I was writing about how Mumia Abu-Jamal had applied the concept of internal colonialism. And Eric King Watts III, who was the editor of the journal that we were submitting this to at the time, in a several backs and forth with me, would not publish the article. And one of his arguments was what is being made here. The internal colonialism theory is not being made. You are not convincingly. So it was largely around. I was not convincing enough that the theory was valid enough. And as Hind says here, that it was not intellectually rigorous enough, that there are too many differences in the experiences, that you can't just say black people aren't internal. And my point to King Watts was, I remember one of the points I was trying to make was, it doesn't matter if you or I think internal colonialism theory is a valid approach. It doesn't matter if you think it's rigorous enough. The point of this article is not to defend internal colonialism as a theoretical approach. It's to point out that Mumia, in his own work, applied it. But he wouldn't publish the article. So I have experienced this myself, where people are saying that as it said here, it's an arguably artificial analogy, obscurantist and misleading. It has a certain superficiality. It has an implicit idealization of pre-colonial societies. Internal colonial theories imply an improbable degree of cohesion and identity of interest among specific social groups, and they oversimplify complex social structures and relationships. Again, maybe this is why Taylor and others don't really rock with it. Most studies appear to be more concerned to demonstrate the validity of a particular analysis than to explore the rich potential of the internal colonial concept in its entirety. On the one hand, I don't agree with it being an arguably artificial analogy or superficial or idea, or I certainly don't agree that I or anyone else that I've read idealizes pre-colonial societies. They, if anything, are just making the point that colonizers don't get to say that pre-colonial societies were so backwards that they deserved all the colonization that they got. But I don't agree. But I do agree, certainly with my own work, that I and some of us have not fully explored the potential of the concept in its entirety. But for me, again, it's more important to highlight the similarities in the application of forms of colonialism than to find all the specific differences. So maybe I can see I would be guilty of oversimplifying complex social structures and relationships, the interests of specific social groups. I don't know. Maybe in my own work I've been guilty of that, but I don't think the theory itself encourages that. In fact, you could make that claim about everybody else. So when people talk, when they talk about the beautiful pluralistic approach to American multicultural, they're doing the same thing. They're oversimplifying complex social structures and relationships. But anyway, but I like that this article at least addressed itself to some of that. So what's my note here? there's a lack of an adequate theory of imperialism. Now, I thought this was an interesting point, that similar to what Veracini says in his article about settler colonial studies, Hind here says that there needs to be a more robust study of imperialism, because imperialism produces so much of the overarching structure for how people involved in internal colonialism theory approach the topic, that that there needs to be more study of imperialism that would improve the quality of the work around internal colonialism. But I wrote here, this is precisely why I like internal colonialism theory, because it requires an adequate theory of imperialism. And that has always been my point, that when you talk about Black America, when the traditional approach to Black history in the United States, yes, again, I don't want to, I'm aware that Black people here have had a very particular experience, but the traditional approach to that history ignores any connection to Black experience here, to the diaspora or other experiences, or to the broader scope of European imperialism. That, yes, what happened to Africans here is particular and specific, but it is part of a broader European imperial process, that traditional approaches or mainstream approaches to American history and Black history don't encourage people to investigate. But the moment you say Black people are an internal colony or are internally colonized, you immediately, that was always been my point, that the US is called an empire all the time, but then discussed in the context of democracy. But empires don't produce democracies, they produce colonies. So that's what I've always liked about the approach, that internal colonialism demands, what is colonialism? It is the process, it is an imperial it is a subset of the imperial process of conquering another group of people. I only highlighted the name Philip Curtin because I remember reading Philip Curtin has a certain infamy in in Africana studies and African-centered spaces, as opposing or looking to impose a very Eurocentric view of African studies. But anyway, just thought that was an interesting reference there. So he just argues that more study needs to be more needs to be done to study imperialism, then it will improve the subsequent studies of internal colonialism. Although the literature on dependency, like that on internal colonialism, raises as many problems as it answers, and although historians would probably find the evidence in the historical part rather thin, it has contributed to the formation of a consensus that the history of colonialism can only be meaningfully approached in the broader spectrum of underdevelopment and the specific problems of the third world. By the way, there's no reference to Rodney in this. He talks a little bit about development and underdevelopment, doesn't mention Rodney, which I thought was interesting, but you know. Oh, here I have a thumbs down here. Since the attainment of independence, however, local ruling classes have frequently implemented policies that continued and perpetuated these characteristics and conditions. This has led to disputed proposition that the experience of Latin America, for example, has demonstrated that underdevelopment is not a decisive consequence of colonialism. One of the points that he makes is that basically that colonialism gets too much of a blame, and that that the current for the current state of affairs, that if you look at Latin America or the continent of Africa today, you couldn't put all the blame on their lack of development on colonialism. And I'm like, well, that's whack. That's why I had to put a whole thumbs down. I don't agree with that. And I don't think anything is done in this article to compellingly make that argument. But to be fair, Hind is only looking to give an overview of the criticisms and the arguments, so not to defend or explain them necessarily. So, but even if the concept is accepted, it will. Even if the validity of this concept is accepted, it will remain to a considerable extent a concept in search of a methodology, that is internal colonialism. It provides a means of approaching domestic historical problems from a particular perspective, one that leans heavily upon comparisons with the colonial experience, and one that draws upon alleged parallels between policies, attitudes, and developments that are discernible within a country as they are within a colony, or within both a metropolitan power and its colonies. This dependence upon comparisons and parallels is not a source of methodological strength. And I wrote here in my notes, this would have been helped by an example of how this method is flawed, because they don't really do that. Because I don't see, how is it a methodological flaw to compare what is happening to Black people here to other colonized communities? So I'd like to see how, and then to what extent would another approach be better? Because again, the preferred approach, the dominant approach, is this one that would have us kind of similar to what Hind was saying a moment ago, to say, look, Black people's problems, and this is where we get, with the whole financial literacy community and Black capitalist community. Hey, the underdevelopment of Black America has nothing to do with colonialism. It has to do with some other factors, something wrong with you. So I would have, on the other hand, scholars' distrust of internal colonial theory and their unwillingness to participate in its development have helped bring about this situation. So I like this part. So Hind is saying, look, critics of internal colonialism theory, your willingness to not participate and just hate on it have exacerbated the flaws and prevented maybe what could be valuable from emerging. And as I said earlier, well, there's good reason to resist internal colonialism as an approach, because again, it demands a whole other frame be applied to understanding what this country is and what to do about it. And it's also going to put you at odds with the world that would be inviting to Dyson and them. If internal colonial theories have come under suspicion in certain circles because of the influence of Marxist thought that is apparent in some of them, it should be noted that there were Europeans prior to the integrated articulation of socialist doctrines who expressed themselves in ways which suggest that they would not have found the internal colonial concept alien. So I like this point. Hind is saying to his colleagues, hey, if you're hating on internal colonialism because of its apparent relationship to Marxism and you're afraid of Marx, you got to be honest. Before Marx, before socialism, there were folks in Europe saying this theory is valid. And my approach to internal colonialism doesn't require the Marxist communist approach. It doesn't require any. It doesn't ignore them. It doesn't say it can't involve them, but you don't need Europe. You could stay strictly within the African world and find a long tradition of an understanding and approach of internal colonialism that is valuable. So even if even in the Black world, if you want to avoid Marx and a Eurocentrism, you can do that. You don't need them to reach the appropriate conclusion. Ulrich B. Phillips, another name I remember, another white Black studies scholar that had to be corrected over time. Yeah, so as he says here, approaches inspired by the internal colonial concept might also assist historians and other social sciences who orient their work towards specific domestic issues or perceived problems. Like, that's sort of my point too, that there's value in the concept in helping understand what's going on here. The internal colonial concept might also have seminal value for scholars who are attracted to the comparative study of society and history, the treatment of certain metropolitan societies or the experience of certain sections of metropolitan society in that of their colonial counterparts in a comparative way and within an internal colonial framework might help to identify features of their respective experiences that could pass undetected or be given insufficient emphasis or be misinterpreted if they were studied separately by other means. That's been my whole point. my own approach to it has always been saying, if people have been studying the Black experience in a variety of ways for a long time, and I think a lot of the popular approaches and conclusions reached by those approaches are insufficient. Part of my own way of attempting to write about this, admittedly I didn't do it well, was to say, look, all of these people, if you read all of these people talking about the Black experience, they're identifying the colonialism Black people suffer. They just don't use the language. So I'm saying, take all that data, take all that analysis, put it within the analytical frame of internal colonialism that returns Black people back to the appropriate world stage of history, that within the context of European imperialism, and then opens up the whole panoply of responses that are discouraged to Black people by more conventional approaches. So that's that. That's all right. It's 10:30. I still got one more section to do here. All right. So anyway, please like, share, subscribe, support the platform, and I hope you all don't mind this extended discussion, flaws and all. I will revisit the chat later and the comments later. And if there's any of you who really think I need to see something or be corrected or in whatever, informed on something, please email me. imixwhatilike@gmail.com. But just wanted to share a little bit of all of that. Let me just make sure. So as I said here, I like internal colonialism theory for its push beyond the Democrats' questions of because it questions Eurocentrism, it questions even the Eurocentrism within socialism and synthesizes questions over nationhood, culture, and materialism. I want to focus on how internal colonialism defines a certain relationship. And then in a discussion about some of this with Brother Netfa recently, I asked him, how do the colonized write about their colonization from within the colony? And I think that's a good way of trying to understand not only how it can be done, but also why the attempts may be flawed, because it's happening from within the colony during the process of an ongoing colonization. And then he with Paca, that is Netfa mentioned with Paca, they're reading Robert Blauner, who I mentioned passingly. They're reading a piece from Patrick Anderson, and another piece on gentrification and settler colonialism by John Kamal Sunjata. So there may be even more discussion of all of that to come as well, because I'd like to I haven't read Blauner in some years, and these other articles, I don't think the Sunjata article I never read. The Patrick Anderson one I read, Black Agenda Report. Some critics argue that internal colonial theory is outdated. Here's why they're wrong. So shout out to Paca and to Net for that as well. All right. So I hope there was some value in that. It made some sense. I certainly enjoyed the discussion, yeah, let's keep pushing through here and talk about Erica Edwards, The Other Side of Terror. And I made a note to myself as a segue to talk about her work here, that breaking news, everybody, Black women are dope. That's the short overview of Erica Edwards' work. And I don't know if you were aware of that already. Breaking news. Black women are pretty dope. Oh, wait a minute. Edward Said, colonialism analysis Edward Said said this, that colonialism analysis seems to ignore capitalism. U.S. analysis and settler colonialism seem more clear on capitalism and colony. Yeah, I would hope so. And again, as I've highlighted in my own attempts for years, because I would use, I talked about, Du Bois called it semi-colonialism. Martin Delaney called it a nation within a nation. Panthers in various ways called it internal colonialism. But Kwame Nkrumah said, if you practice capitalism, you're practicing domestic colonialism. So there is an absolute and I've always liked it because you have to deal with capitalism in class in a discussion of internal colonialism. You have to deal with imperialism, and you also have to deal with the immaterial part, the cultural part, the uh, um, the symbolic value that colonization provides to the colonizer. So I've always thought, and right, breaking news, Black women are dope. And what Erica Edwards has done with this book is fascinating. I don't, again, this is I'm new to it. I haven't read every page, and I think with all this stuff, in some ways I'm reading too quickly. I'm not studying. I'm not well versed in all the Black feminist literature that she references. So, but similar to what I was saying about these other articles, even where I'm not fully understanding, maybe not fully in agreement, I've loved the I don't know, the intellectual struggle, the challenge, the ideas, the arguments, I loved it. Yeah. So I'm loving the book. We're going to work from today a little bit of a video that she did, a presentation she gave, so to help us along here as well. And then this will not be the end of it. She's been invited, so if Professor Edwards is ever available, we'll talk with her here. But as and I will be revisiting this because increasingly her book and work is going to play a role in my classes and maybe my own other work. So as I mentioned the other day, I think what I'm evolving here is a sort of Edwards versus Halliday. So folks remember, and I'll put the links if they're not, I don't remember if I put them there already. If they're not, I'll put them there. When Professor Aria Halliday kind of took a shot at me, hated on me a little bit on Left of Black with Mark Anthony Neal, and, didn't fully say no, but, never agreed to come on in an interview with me. But she wrote her book about, I'll put the link. I forget the full title, but Aria Halliday's book about black buying. What was it? Let me just hold on a second. My bad. But she wrote her book that I enjoy. Even it's by Black, how Black women transformed U.S. pop culture. That's the way I'm oversimplifying her argument, and where I think we disagree, is that Halliday represents a wing of argumentation. Jason Chambers is in there. Some others that I'm reading are in there. In fact, Jason Chambers' book is in this category. Maggie Anderson is in this category. I would put Brianna Wynn Greer's book, Represented, is in this category. What else am I looking at that's in this category? Yeah, Advertising Revolutionary about Tom Burrell is in this. That's Jason Chambers' work is in this category. Jeffrey Ogbar's America's Black Capital about Atlanta, a little bit is in this category. What else is in this category? In fact, I'll even share my screen here. This is my Kindle category that I'm working with for this book chapter. These are some of the books that I have on Kindle that I'm working from. So this is the book here by Black from Halliday that I'm talking about, Represented by Greer is in, and the category I'm referencing is a category of scholarship that is saying more or less Black people's increased participation in pop culture, marketing, advertising has been a net positive. All right. And where I think, and this is why I said verse, and I don't know that, I don't think either Edwards or Halliday would accept this. So this is just me doing it, and I feel a little funny about doing it, but this is where I think I'm headed. Edwards represents a wing of scholarship that is saying, all right, there may have been some interesting or even positive things that have happened with Black increased participation by Black people in these spaces, but there have been many problems. And I don't know where Edwards yet. I don't know if I've concluded yet where she falls in terms of the net positive or negative. I'm projecting my bias and saying she's saying it's a net negative. Certainly with what we're going to look at this morning. But so that's anyway, that's the frame that I'm worried. Halliday versus Edwards. And Edwards is saying, no, there's a counterinsurgency element happening here by the state's increased involvement in this specific instance that Edwards is talking about of Black women in the state itself. All right. And in pop culture. And so Black women are said by Halliday and Chambers and them to be leading the way, while Edwards is showing how during that same time, Black women are situated as symbols of counterinsurgency. So Chambers and Halliday are talking about a lot about a post 1970s, 80s, and 90s and into the 2000s world where Black people, Black women in particular, are becoming more involved in pop culture, advertising, politics. And Halliday is saying that this is leading the way forward of a progressive new era. And Edwards is saying something it's not quite that way. So I want to show a little bit of, and I'll make sure the link is in the show description because this is a great presentation that she gives on her book. And I want to start right here. And this is why I got the thumbnail. And I think where I'm starting it, there's enough, you won't miss too much context, but she's using Kerry Washington to introduce us to the concept of her that Edwards employs here of imperial grammars of Blackness. The way that empire uses Black suffering and symbolism to advance itself. All right, so I think we can pick it up right here for a few minutes. And again, this is Dr. Erica Edwards presenting on her work. By the way, this is a good channel, Black Women Radicals. I would encourage, we can subscribe BLM. I'm subscribed already, but let's subscribe.
Night as an actor. I'm here as a mother, a daughter, a Washington fixer.
Hold on, let me back.
Democratic National Convention. So I have read none of it. And wherever you... Okay.
All right, we'll start it here.
Let me move this out of the way. Okay, so I thought we would start here with a moment from current events. So at the 2024 Democratic National Convention, Kerry Washington appeared with her Scandal co-star Tony Goldwyn, both of whom became more famous than they already were when they starred in the Shonda Rhimes series Scandal. And Kerry Washington briefly reprised her role as a Washington fixer. So this is what she said in her speech at the convention. But I'm not here tonight as an actor. I'm here as a mother, a daughter, a proud union member, the granddaughter of immigrants, and a Black woman descended from enslaved people. I am here tonight because I am an American and I am a voter. I am the one standing on this stage, but I am not the lead character in this story. You are the fixers, dare I say it, you are the Olivia Popes. So I wanted to start there because there are two kind of serious moments in my book when I talk about Kerry Washington. One, when she appears at the end of Spike Lee's Black World War II film. She appears to sort of save the day, right? She comes in as a powerful corporate lawyer who like emasculates the judge who is getting ready to sentence this Black Puerto Rican veteran. The other moment I analyze is when Kerry Washington appears as Olivia Pope in the Shonda Rhimes series Scandal, a series in which Olivia Pope's affair with the Republican president helps save the Union again and again. But there's a third moment that when I write about Kerry Washington in a more oblique way, when I refer to her role in Save the Last Dance, a film where she showed up as the foil to the protagonist, Sarah, played by Julia Stiles. So in that film, Washington plays a gritty single mother from the South Side of Chicago who wears her hair short and natural-ish and helps teach the white girl how to do hip hop dance. So since the book has been in print, I've always felt embarrassed about this one paragraph. Like maybe it was too indulgent. Like maybe this is where the book got away from me. Like this is where I was just doing a little bit too much. So here's what I wrote. The teenage dance film might be the version of the interracial war film made just for people like you. People who became Coco or Leroy each time you hopped up on the sofa with your sister and your cousin from Cleveland. The three of you belting your hearts out while learning to fly and perhaps living forever. You eventually settled for latecomers to the genre like Save the Last Dance. If nothing else, because the Black South Side high schoolers teaching the white girl to dance were teaching your ass something too. Imagine your surprise when the miracle you so needed then grows up to be the miracle that can only be aggressively disbelieved now. So this is the paragraph that leads into my reading of the Spike Lee film, Miracle at St. Anna, a war film. So revisiting this sort of embarrassing moment in my text now, I can see that what I was trying to make sense of is representation and betrayal, right? I was trying to make sense of how it is that Black women play lots of different kinds of roles within imperial culture. And what I mean by imperial culture is the expressive culture, the literature and film and music that emerge, the expressive culture that emerges both within and in conflict with a nation state defined by its expansionist tendency. So how it is that Black women play multiple roles within imperial culture, and that those roles are always shifting between fidelity to some imagined Black community and fidelity to some imagined national community, which is to say, every appearance of the Black woman on the national stage is an act of betrayal of some sort. And I was trying to think through that. So
hold on a second. Hold on a second, because to me, when I hear that, oh man, I gotta get better with this platform. When I hear that,
now listen, that's called my boy.
Let's rewind that just a second there for a second.
So how it is that Black women play multiple roles within imperial culture, and that those roles are always shifting between fidelity to some imagined Black community and fidelity to some imagined national community, which is to say, every appearance of the Black woman on the national stage is an act of betrayal of some sort. And I was trying to think through that. So, as someone who deals with histories of the present, it's hard not to feel some kind of like sick satisfaction when things like this happen, right? Like when what I wrote about in my book comes into such absurd articulation in the world itself. When a Black woman runs for president and she is endorsed by a Black woman who played the Black woman who saved American democracy by stealing an election, and becoming the mistress of the white president she helped put in office. When an actor cosplaying as the fixer character she played is urging us to fix American democracy by voting for someone who looks like us. An actor casting us in the role of fixer, urging us to make our voices count in a moment when we are losing sleep, when we are losing our jobs, protesting a genocidal campaign or another cop city. So the question that I think I'd like for us to focus on in this teaching is...
All right, so let me pause it here for a second because I just wanted to play that initial setup. And maybe Zenzi is pointing out here that I've pointing to the fact that I haven't done Edwards. I haven't set this up properly. So, because I thought in my notes here tell me that she explains the point that I wanted her to make, that I hear her making in that clip on her own, but I didn't. Maybe what I understand her to be saying, and so it's not. I'm sorry. Let me pull that question back up. Zenzi's asking, is she saying that that only happens when sisters play the roles? Because I'm seriously confused. No, so in one part, yes, because Edwards' book is talking specifically about the particular impact and use of Black women by empire to use their presence to symbolically act as a counterinsurgency against Black radicalism. And she points that is so Edwards, but what Edwards is more broadly doing, and this is where I didn't probably set this up properly. What she's saying, what I understand her to be saying in her book is she's saying, listen, especially after 9/11, there has been, and she breaks it down, and I have it, I did have that part sectioned off where the graphic at minute 37. So let me pull it up here, and I think this will help. So at minute 37, she puts on screen this graphic here. I think this should expand. No, it's the same one. So this is an sort of the overview that she's working from in the book. That from 1968 to 1980, there was a particular, as she says here, post-1960s counterinsurgency figure of the terrorist surveillance and policing. There was a particular approach to discussing popularly, nationally, what is terrorism, what is surveillance, what is policing, and there was an initial invitation of Blackness into that experience, projected into that experience. From 1980 to 2001, as she says, there was the New World Order, the rise of the new right wing, the war on drugs, militarization of law enforcement, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim racial panics, and a high neoliberalism on the rise. So now, in the context of what we were talking about earlier, and the way I would use this in my work and in maybe in classrooms, et cetera, and definitely when we talk about, because we're going to use her work later in the semester in my propaganda course, as I call it, is that this is the process of settler colonialism or internal colonialism or colonialism playing out. That as the settler colonial experience shifts, evolves, rebrands itself in terms of what's in response to internal insurgent political movements and those happening around the world, there needs to be a sort of a new way to engage those meaning to be ruled, those meaning to be colonized. So Edwards starts to talk about Black women becoming more prominent in both politically leading the state. So in the 2001 to 2012 new racial domain era that she's talking about, that is Edwards, she's talking about this is where you get a new rise of the Condoleezza Rices, the Barack Obamas, the Colin Powells in the political spaces. And in the pop cultural spaces, you get the Olivia Popes and the I'm forgetting the other examples that she's using, but you get all of them. And then she's talking about that's where she's talking about in that clip there. So wait a minute, as the country itself is becoming falsely post-racial. She talks a little bit about her own experience with the hopes that she had at one point for Barack Obama and all of that. And as this new racial domain takes over and the new racialization of Islam takes over, you have an increase in Black women playing a role in supporting all of that. So Olivia Pope's role in Scandal is to through her, as Edward says, through her affair with the president, save the country, to save empire. Her job is to be a fixer for empire. Her role in that Save the Last Dance film is to be a fixer for white empire, just through the element of teaching dance. So that's why I'm saying that to me, it's Edwards versus Halliday, because Halliday and Chambers and them are saying, no, the more Black women step into these spaces, the more they positively complicate the discussion and the politics of the country. And as I'm reading and understanding Edwards, she's saying, no, this is not what's happening. They're being used to as counterinsurgency to aid the state. And that's what she means when she's talking about imperial grammars of Blackness. So in fact, I'll back it up here to where she's talking about Colin Powell and the miraculous me. The imperial grammars of Blackness, the use of Black language, music, performance, visual codes, and gestures to link U.S. violence abroad to the signs of multicultural progress at home. So I had been using Christopher Mott's woke imperialism, but I'd much prefer to use a Black woman's framing here of imperial grammars of Blackness. That specifically Black suffering and performance is simultaneously all being used to justify and to again to promote as progress and multicultural progress at home when it's imperial violence, it's colonization, it's abroad and at home. So. And good, Zenzi. I hope that did clarify. And sorry if I wasn't, and that's what I'm saying. Like, to be fair, like all of the stuff I've referenced, all of it needs more organization and presentation and study from all of us. And that's ultimately what I'm encouraging. And anyway, but let me see if I got the timestamp right here, where she talks a little bit about. And now I haven't read the part of the book that she mentioned there, because I like that Spike Lee movie, The Miracle at St. Anna. It's one of the few more recent Spike Lee, more modern contemporary Spike Lee films, later Spike Lee films that I actually liked at all. So I'm very interested to see what she says about that.
Affirmed Black representation as the sign of enlightenment, with political figures like Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and the Obamas announcing the nation's fitness as a world leader in multicultural democracy. So, like at his confirmation hearing, for example, Colin Powell referred to himself as like miraculous me, right? And said that his appointment as Secretary of State would show to the world what is possible in this country, right? So Black representation as a kind of key feature of empire building, a key rationalization of empire building, that meaning a kind of strategy for making sense of and making the case for empire building. I think it's really important that we bring clarity to the term empire. Sometimes we use the term almost cartoonishly, like we're talking about, superheroes fighting against evil, or we're talking about the Sith Lords in Star Wars, like the evil empire. Um, Empire is not just like everything bad, right? Empire is a specific mode of power that operates through the logic of annexation and attachment, expansion and settling, right? So the form that imperialism took through the late post-war decades, right? And I mean post-World War II decades, was globalization, right? The construction of what was called a new world order, the building of an unfettered economy that demanded political and cultural rationalities to build consent, right? To make people believe that was the right mode of governance.
Again, golly, that is okay. So that
Now listen.
so that's why I'm saying it's for me Edwards versus these others, because she's showing and already in what I've read, she's making the case very strongly, and she does a good job of laying it out in this video, that again, first of all, considering what we were talking about earlier around the definitions of colonialism, this is very helpful what she just said right here, because we ended with Hind talking about we need a better understanding of imperialism to which will help us in our studies of colonization, whatever form. Edwards is saying something very similar here. If we understand what empire is, as I said earlier, we understand it doesn't create democracies, it creates colonies, and it creates a different set of relationships that are not democratic and based on freedom and liberty and all this other kind of stuff and equality. It's something else. And she just said right there what has been ultimately my point, that the broader process of European imperialism, particularly over the last 500 years, necessitates an understanding that it's going to take various forms, all of which are better understood under whatever variant of colonialism you want to call it. But that's the form. She just said there, whether it's settler or this, it's like the whole point is empire. She said it goes back and forth between attachment and how did she phrase it just there? But of how did she put it? She had it working dialectically, that it's about them over there, but it's also about attaching oneself to. It's about settling. It's about, in other words, whatever the form is, the goal is empire and imperialism. So when she's talking about over this effort of counterinsurgency over the last, particularly, 50, 60 years, that's why I have to say it's versus these other scholars who are saying, no, because within that there has been this inclusivity and this advance and progress that Black people have made, and even improvement over in terms of the country. We've improved the country by becoming more involved in it. And as I'm hearing and reading Edwards, she's saying, no. These are imperial grammars. All right, but let's see. And then what she says here, let me move it a little. What she says here about Black women and security is very dope as well. So let me just move it to about right here.
Emerge in our own public life, right? Like I'm thinking about how in Kamala Harris's convention speech, she told the story of her childhood friend, a girl named Wanda, who was being sexually abused. And that's what inspired Harris to become a prosecutor, to keep women safe, right? So the imperial grammars of Blackness tie Black women's achievement to protection and also to danger, right? So we see how the increased representation of Black women in public places and in public positions became necessary for the industries and the image of crisis management and national security and counterterrorism. So between the Cold War and the 2000s, so between 1989 and like the post 9/11 moment, we saw this alignment of Blackness and security. It was during this time that popular culture made over old tropes, like the old tropes of Black femininity, like Jezebel and Mammy. Like, popular culture still had use for those symbols and images, but it layered over them with new symbologies, or what I call in the book, new Black femininities. It was in this context when Black women were made over into the image of protectors. It was in this context that Kerry Washington became the first Black woman to star in an hour-long network series with Scandal, right? So we might see that as the culmination of this successful, agential, protective, professional Black femininity at the center of police power and juridical prowess. Okay.
All right. So I just wanted to that again. That's the emphasis for me. Not what positives did this all play in advancing the country, or as Jeff Chang, I mean, my homeboy Davey D at one point was saying, hip hop paved the way to prepare the country for a Black president and all that kind of stuff. Like, I ended my notes here by saying, I'm saying that pop culture is meant to be the negation of the negation. And as I told someone who may be appearing here sometime soon to debate me around Afro-pessimism, that I don't look at anything. How did I phrase it? Anyway, the point being that it's a net negative for me when the more Blackness appears and participates, the and is brought into participation, the more of a net negative it is. All right. All right, I do need to start wrapping up here. So let me just do this. We'll obviously return to more about Edward's work, and hopefully she'll join us herself. But I do want to leave it this way, the way she sort of seems to be ending, well, the way she ends this presentation and the way she may be ending the book, that she talks about, and I've focused on so far the insurgent or imperial grammars, but she does also talk about insurgent grammars. Now, what I love about what I see her doing with this is that she's not saying, again, like others seem to be saying, hey, but there's some positives to these Black women being brought in to play their role in imperial grammar. When she starts talking about insurgent grammars, she's saying, but what this popularity was meant to do is to negate the insurgent grammars, and particularly the insurgent grammars of Black women who during this same time period were producing literature, films, etc., that were meant to say, yo, we're not down with all of this. So Edward starts to talk about Toni Cade Bambara, Hazel Carby, Hortense Spillers, June Jordan. She talks about June Jordan's essay, where I must have gotten my own argumentation around this, where she reformulates Malcolm's house slave versus the house Negro versus the field Negro to say, because I've made the argument myself, she not as well, but the point being that Black America is the world's house Negro. because we live in the imperial core, because we live in the master's house. Yeah, we may have it bad, but well, nowadays I wouldn't characterize it versus better or worse, but I would characterize it as different. Our relationship plays out differently. It's the same one, but it plays out differently. And my point in bringing this up is that Edwards does beautifully and with much better organization and writing, et cetera, lay out for us when you're seeing Kerry Washington and Oprah and whoever else on TV and in film, and when you're seeing Colin Powell and specifically Condoleezza Rice or I can't think of any other, or Kamala Harris or any other prominent Black political figure, that they exist to negate all of the Black women who are saying, hey, that's not what we're arguing for here. Our point isn't to condemn racism and patriarchy and capital to say that we want to participate in that. Going back to the earlier discussion, we're not wanting to concretize ourselves in a settler colonial relationship as the permanent representation of an indigenous colonized population. We want to end the relationship. And shout out to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. They just re-aired it. I think it's a re-air of a discussion about Toni Cade Bambara's work. I got to get caught. I have not. I'm way behind. I didn't know about her many movies. Haven't read enough of her work. I don't read fiction. But the point being, as Edwards points out, there have been Black women writing and telling us for a long time, we're not part of this. We don't want to become a Black Barbie. We don't want to help market Coca-Cola and McDonald's to Black communities. That's not how our Black femininity, that's not what we mean by Black womanhood or Black liberation. We are insurgent grammarians. Yo. So anyway, much more on Edwards' work with her in directly. She's always invited or indirectly. And I'll definitely encourage people to watch that full presentation because it's great and the book is brilliant. And yeah, in Zanzibar, that's exactly my whole point. That all of you who have been making this point, a lot of you who have been making this point, you are who these Kerry Washington representations are meant to erase. And you're meant to be, they're meant to be held up so that when Zanzibar and crew walk in the room talking about something else, people can say, no, because I saw Scandal last week. You don't sound like Kamala. Yeah. Anyway, so let's see. The question is, what is the purpose of those Black people's representation by the empire? So this is what I think Edwards, and certainly what I'm saying, is that the purpose is empire has to constantly find new ways to expand and to maintain itself. And the use of symbol and the use of messaging and narrative and media have become more and more important. And the co-optive ability to say, oh, Black people are struggling. Okay, fine. We'll put them on TV. And then we'll put them on TV prominently, as Edwards is pointing out here, saving empire. Then as she says, we want to highlight Colin Powell saying, I'm a miracle. They want Drake saying, I came from the bottom, now I'm here. With the idea being that can only happen within an American capitalist music industry. They love that stuff. So that's why. And then we get caught up in the presentation and the excitement of seeing ourselves and lose sight of what's really going on. All right, good people. This has been a great morning. Maybe go out here, play in the snow. But please do like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon. And come on back tomorrow for the return of the Remix Morning Show. And yeah. 6888 was a mess. And your mother couldn't understand why you felt the way at the end of the film. Yeah. That's it. Only in America. And America wants credit for that. See, here in America, we've provided you with such a singularly unique experience of enslavement and potential progress to overcome. It was all worth it. Now, thank you, Brittany. Thank you, everybody. This has been great. I love spending the morning this way. And now maybe the rest of the family's awake and I could go see them. But again, listen, everybody, support the platform. Stay safe out there. Of course, peace only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you next time right here at I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
And what do you sacrifice?
Calm. Kindness, kinship. Love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.